Have you ever noticed something disturbing? The moment your life gets close to changing, you suddenly become tired, distracted, unmotivated. You procrastinate harder, escape more, overthink more, and then somehow you fail again. But what if that failure was not accidental? What if part of you wanted it, not consciously, not rationally, but psychologically? Because failure does something terrifyingly comforting. It protects you from being fully seen. Most people think they fear failure. They do not. Failure is familiar, predictable, safe. What people truly fear is exposure. The exposure that comes from genuinely trying, from giving everything, from removing every excuse. Because then there is nowhere left to hide. If you fail while distracted, you can blame distraction. If you fail while procrastinating, you can blame laziness. If you fail while half-trying, you can tell yourself, I could have succeeded if I really wanted to. That fantasy protects the ego beautifully, because the ego would rather preserve the illusion of potential than confront the possibility of limitation. And modern life makes this addiction worse. We live in a world where everyone performs perfection constantly. Perfect bodies, perfect careers, perfect confidence, perfect lifestyles, everyone broadcasting edited versions of existence. And inside that environment, trying sincerely becomes psychologically dangerous. Because sincere effort risks public inadequacy. What if you try your hardest and still are not enough? That question terrifies people more than failure itself. So the brain creates a survival strategy, self-sabotage. Not because the brain hates you, because it wants to protect your identity from collapse. The mind says, stay small, stay hidden, stay unfinished. Potential is safer than proof. And slowly, this becomes addictive. People start building entire personalities around unrealized greatness. The writer who never finishes, the entrepreneur who never launches, the artist who keeps preparing endlessly, the person constantly about to begin. Because unfinished dreams contain no measurable failure yet, only possibility. And possibility is emotionally intoxicating. Reality is not. Reality introduces judgment, comparison, consequences, exposure. So the brain quietly learns something dangerous. Predictable disappointment feels safer than uncertain success. At least disappointment is familiar. At least failure keeps expectations low. At least failure allows the ego to survive intact. Because success changes things. Success creates visibility, pressure, responsibility, higher expectations, new levels of scrutiny. And many people are not actually prepared emotionally for the life they claim to want. So they unconsciously sabotage movement toward it. Not dramatically, subtly, tiny delays, tiny excuses, tiny distractions repeated daily until years disappear quietly. And the terrifying part is this: the brain rewards this behavior. Every time you retreat into comfort, you feel temporary relief, temporary safety, temporary escape from uncertainty. That relief becomes neurological reinforcement. The nervous system starts associating avoidance with survival, and effort with danger. That is why people can crave success consciously while sabotaging it subconsciously. Two systems fighting internally. One wants growth, the other wants safety. And safety usually wins, especially in a world addicted to convenience and emotional escape. So if you constantly feel trapped in cycles of hesitation, cycles of procrastination, cycles of almost becoming, you are not simply lazy. You are likely protecting an identity too fragile to survive honest failure. And until you understand that, you will keep mistaking self-protection for self-destruction, when in reality, your brain has been trying to save you the entire time, even if that safety is slowly ruining your life. The high cost of being safe. Your brain does not care about your dreams as much as you think it does. It cares about survival. That is the brutal truth, not thriving, not greatness, not potential, survival. And survival is deeply conservative psychologically. The brain prefers familiar pain over unfamiliar possibility, because familiar pain feels manageable, predictable, controllable. But growth introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty feels dangerous to the nervous system, especially in the modern world. a world overflowing with comparison. Visibility, judgment, endless exposure. Every ambition now feels public. Every mistake feels permanent. Every failure feels archived digitally somewhere forever. So the brain adapts the only way it knows how: stay safe. Stay hidden, do not risk too much. Do not expose your full capability, because exposure creates vulnerability, and vulnerability threatens identity. This is where the ego enters the story. Most people misunderstand the ego completely. They think ego means arrogance, confidence, superiority. But fragile egos often look insecure instead. Avoidant, defensive, perfectionistic. The ego is simply the internal image you protect psychologically. The version of yourself you desperately need to believe is real. And that image becomes fragile when reality threatens it. Think about someone who secretly believes they are intelligent, talented, special, capable of greatness. That belief feels comforting internally. But the moment they genuinely compete, reality can test it, measure it, expose it. And if reality contradicts the identity, the emotional damage feels devastating. So the ego creates defense mechanisms preemptively: avoidance, delay, perfectionism, half-effort, excuses, anything preventing full exposure. Because partial effort preserves fantasy beautifully. If you never fully commit, you never fully find out. And uncertainty protects self-image better than failure ever could. That is why many people remain trapped in preparation mode forever, researching endlessly, planning endlessly, talking endlessly, imagining endlessly, but rarely entering real friction. Because friction creates feedback, and feedback threatens illusion. The ego fears this deeply. It would rather stay potentially brilliant forever than risk becoming measurably average publicly. This is the hidden psychological cost of safety. You preserve identity but sacrifice transformation. You protect self-image but abandon growth. You avoid humiliation but slowly suffocate possibility. And modern comfort culture reinforces this constantly. Everything designed to reduce discomfort. Instant entertainment, instant dopamine, instant distraction, instant escape from uncertainty. The brain becomes conditioned to avoid friction entirely. Even tiny discomfort feels unbearable now. Silence feels unbearable. Boredom feels unbearable. Slow progress feels unbearable. So people retreat into comfort loops constantly, checking phones, scrolling endlessly, watching other people live, imagining future versions of themselves instead of building them. Because imagination provides emotional reward without real vulnerability. Reality requires vulnerability. Reality requires risking inadequacy openly, and most egos are too fragile for that initially. This creates a biological trap called the comfort zone. People speak about the comfort zone casually, but it is not casual psychologically. It is neurological conditioning. The nervous system associates familiarity with safety, even when familiarity is miserable. That is why people stay inside painful situations for years. Jobs they hate, relationships draining them, identities shrinking them, habits destroying them, because predictable suffering still feels safer than uncertain change. The comfort zone does not always feel comfortable. Sometimes it feels depressing, empty, deadening, but it feels known, and the brain worships what is known. Even stagnation can become addictive if it protects emotional stability. That is why people sabotage opportunities subconsciously. A new opportunity threatens the current identity structure. More success means more expectations, more visibility, more pressure, more possibility of public failure. So the nervous system quietly creates resistance. You procrastinate suddenly, feel exhausted suddenly, lose motivation suddenly. Not because the opportunity is wrong necessarily, because growth triggered psychological danger internally. The brain says, if you stay where you are, at least you survive emotionally. That survival instinct becomes expensive over time. Years expensive, dreams expensive, identity expensive, because safety accumulates hidden regret slowly, and regret is strange psychologically. At first it whispers, quiet discomfort, quiet envy watching others move forward, quiet frustration. But over time, regret evolves into something heavier: bitterness, cynicism, emotional numbness. The person begins mocking ambition because ambition reminds them of their own abandoned potential. That is one of the saddest transformations possible. A human being convincing themselves growth was meaningless simply because fear prevented them from pursuing it fully. And underneath all of this exists one devastating truth: the ego often values emotional protection more than actual fulfillment. That is why people sabotage love, sabotage careers, sabotage opportunities, sabotage health. Not because they consciously want destruction, because destruction feels psychologically safer than exposure. Failure creates pain, but sincere effort creates vulnerability. And vulnerability is where the fragile ego feels most threatened, so it chooses safety repeatedly, even when safety slowly becomes a prison. Especially when safety slowly becomes a prison. Because the longer someone remains hidden, the more terrifying visibility becomes. The longer someone delays action, the heavier action feels psychologically. The longer someone avoids risk, the weaker their tolerance for uncertainty becomes. That is why stagnation compounds, comfort compounds, avoidance compounds, and eventually people confuse survival with living. But surviving emotionally is not the same thing as becoming fully alive. Real growth demands something terrifying: the willingness to let reality touch your identity directly, to risk being seen trying, to risk imperfection publicly, to risk discovering that greatness is not guaranteed. Because only then can something stronger emerge, a self no longer dependent on illusion for survival. The dopamine of predictable defeat, the human brain, is not designed to chase happiness. It is designed to avoid danger. That distinction changes everything. Because danger to the nervous system does not always mean physical harm anymore. In the modern world, psychological discomfort became the new predator. Embarrassment, rejection, judgment, failure, exposure. These emotional experiences activate the brain almost like survival threats. So the nervous system adapts accordingly. It begins preferring certainty over possibility, even when certainty is painful. This is why predictable defeat becomes addictive, because predictable defeat feels emotionally manageable. You already know how disappointment feels. You already know how stagnation feels. You already know how regret feels. The pain is familiar. And familiarity creates psychological safety. But success is unpredictable. Success changes identity, changes expectations, changes how people see you, changes how you see yourself. And the brain interprets radical change as instability. That instability creates anxiety. So people unconsciously return to familiar failure patterns repeatedly. Not because they enjoy suffering consciously, because suffering they understand feels safer than transformation they cannot control. This creates a neurological loop, a devastating one. You avoid meaningful risk. You escape into comfort. You feel temporary relief. The brain rewards the relief chemically. Dopamine, not the deep dopamine of achievement, the shallow dopamine of avoidance. And modern technology perfected this trap completely. Every distraction now provides low-stakes emotional reward instantly. Scrolling, gaming, short videos, notifications, endless stimulation without meaningful vulnerability. The brain receives tiny dopamine hits constantly without risking failure publicly. No judgment, no exposure, no emotional danger, just safe engagement, safe stimulation, safe escape. This is why digital distraction feels so comforting. It creates the illusion of activity without the risk of real effort. You feel occupied without being challenged, engaged without being vulnerable, alive without truly participating in life. And the brain loves this arrangement initially, because real goals require uncertainty. Real goals require delayed gratification. Real goals require emotional exposure. But digital dopamine asks almost nothing from you, only attention. And attention becomes easier to surrender than effort. So people slowly become neurologically conditioned toward passive existence, watching instead of building, consuming instead of creating, imagining instead of risking. And over time, the nervous system begins associating real ambition with stress while associating distraction with safety. That reversal is catastrophic psychologically, because now growth itself feels threatening internally. You can feel this conflict clearly. Someone sits down to work on the thing that matters most, a business, a project, a dream. Immediately the discomfort appears. Restlessness, anxiety, mental fog. Suddenly checking the phone feels urgent. Suddenly cleaning the room feels important. Suddenly exhaustion appears from nowhere. Why? Because meaningful effort activates uncertainty, and uncertainty activates threat detection. The brain says, this matters. If this fails, it means something. So avoidance behaviors emerge automatically to reduce emotional tension, and every successful avoidance reinforces the pattern further. This is how predictable defeat becomes addictive neurologically, not dramatic addiction, subtle addiction. The addiction to emotional safety, the addiction to staying unfinished, the addiction to remaining potentially great instead of measurably imperfect. And perhaps the most dangerous part of this loop is the identity it creates. The misunderstood genius, the person who could have been incredible, the talented individual who never got the right opportunity, the dreamer constantly blocked by circumstances. This narrative becomes emotionally seductive because it protects self-worth while explaining underachievement simultaneously. It allows people to feel special without enduring the vulnerability required for mastery. And society romanticizes this archetype constantly. The tortured creative, the overlooked visionary, the undiscovered talent. People become addicted to the story of their potential because the story demands less than reality. Reality demands execution, consistency, exposure, humility. Reality demands surviving evidence, and evidence is terrifying. Evidence reveals whether fantasy survives contact with friction. That is why some people unconsciously prefer dreaming over doing forever. Dreams contain infinite perfection. Reality contains measurable imperfection, so the ego clings to fantasy identities desperately, especially online. Modern digital culture allows endless identity simulation. People can perform ambition without building anything, perform wisdom without discipline, perform confidence without courage, perform productivity without creating meaningful results. The image becomes more rewarding than the process itself. And eventually, the brain stops distinguishing between symbolic progress and real progress. Watching motivational content feels productive. Planning feels productive. Talking about goals feels productive. But nothing changes materially, because the dopamine came from emotional simulation, not actual transformation. This creates a haunting emotional state. People feel exhausted despite barely moving forward. Why? Because imagined effort still consumes emotional energy. The brain partially experiences fantasy scenarios as reality, so people mentally rehearse success endlessly while physically remaining stagnant. That disconnect creates frustration, shame, emotional numbness. And instead of confronting the real issue, many retreat deeper into distraction, deeper into fantasy, deeper into predictable defeat. Because at least predictable defeat preserves identity stability. Real risk threatens identity completely, especially if success changes everything. And that is another hidden fear rarely discussed. Some people fear success because success destroys excuses. No more blaming circumstances. No more blaming timing. No more hiding behind unrealized potential. Success demands evolution, responsibility, consistency, visibility, and many nervous systems are not prepared for that level of exposure emotionally. So they retreat into smaller lives unconsciously. Lives painful enough to complain about, but safe enough to survive psychologically. That is the dopamine of predictable defeat, a nervous system choosing familiar suffering over uncertain expansion. Not because you are weak, because your brain learned safety matters more than freedom. Until one day the pain of staying the same finally becomes greater than the fear of becoming different. Breaking the identity shield. At some point, you must confront a terrifying possibility. What if the voice inside your head is not protecting you, but imprisoning you? Most people trust their internal monologue automatically. Every doubt, every hesitation, every fearful prediction. They assume the voice is rational, objective, protective. But the mind is not always designed for truth. It is designed for preservation. And preservation often means keeping your identity stable at all costs, even if that identity is destroying your future. This is the identity shield, a psychological defense system built to protect the version of yourself your ego became emotionally attached to. And once identity forms deeply, the mind begins defending it aggressively, even against growth, especially against growth. Because growth threatens continuity. Think about how often people say, "I'm just not disciplined. I'm not confident. I'm naturally lazy. I'm not the type of person who succeeds." These statements sound descriptive, but often they are protective. If identity becomes fixed, you no longer need to risk transformation. The mind says, "This is simply who we are." And suddenly stagnation feels justified instead of frightening. That is why fixed identities become addictive. They remove uncertainty, remove responsibility, remove the terrifying possibility that change might actually be possible. Because possibility creates pressure. If change is possible, then avoidance becomes harder to excuse. So the mind weaponizes self-doubt instead, quietly, constantly, not always loudly, sometimes subtly. Tiny thoughts repeated daily. You'll embarrass yourself. You're not ready yet. Other people are naturally better. Wait until you improve first. Stay safe. People mistake these thoughts for wisdom, but often they are fear wearing the costume of intelligence. And the more you obey these thoughts, the stronger the identity shield becomes. This is why many people remain trapped despite desperately wanting change consciously. One part of them wants growth. Another part fears what growth would expose, because growth demands entering arenas where you are no longer special automatically, no longer protected by potential, no longer hidden behind excuses. Just effort, feedback, reality. And reality is emotionally brutal for fragile identities, especially identities built around natural talent. Modern culture worships talent obsessively. The gifted child, the born genius, the effortless success story. People become addicted to appearing naturally exceptional because effort feels dangerous to the ego. Why? Because effort introduces the possibility of visible struggle, and visible struggle threatens perfection. If you are naturally talented, failure can always be blamed on lack of effort. But once you genuinely commit, failure becomes harder to rationalize. That is why many talented people self-sabotage chronically, not because they lack ability, because they built identities around being effortlessly capable. And real growth destroys effortless identity completely. Growth is friction, confusion, repetition, embarrassment, plateaus, temporary incompetence. The ego hates this process initially. It wants immediate mastery, immediate validation, immediate proof of superiority. But mastery humiliates everyone first. That is the hidden cost of becoming anything meaningful. You must survive periods where your current identity feels insufficient, and many people cannot tolerate this emotionally. So they retreat into old narratives. I lost motivation. It's not the right time. I'm burned out. Sometimes these things are true, but often they become psychological camouflage hiding fear of exposure, fear of competing honestly, fear of discovering your limits publicly, fear of realizing you are not exceptional automatically, and perhaps the deepest fear of all, fear of success itself. Most people never examine this seriously. They assume they only fear failure. But success introduces terrifying consequences psychologically. Higher expectations, more visibility, more pressure, more scrutiny, more responsibility. Success removes invisibility, and invisibility feels safe. When nobody expects greatness from you, failure feels easier to survive emotionally. But once success appears, the stakes rise. People watch more closely, judge more closely, expect more consistently, and the fragile ego panics, because maintaining identity suddenly feels exhausting. This is why people sabotage momentum right before breakthroughs constantly. The closer they move toward real transformation, the stronger resistance becomes internally. Not because progress is wrong, because the old identity senses death approaching. And psychologically, identity death feels terrifying, even when the identity deserves to die. That is why growth often feels like grief. You are mourning previous versions of yourself, previous coping mechanisms, previous limitations, previous narratives that once kept you emotionally safe. But safety eventually becomes confinement, and confinement slowly becomes suffering. This is the moment where transformation truly begins, when you stop protecting identity and start protecting growth instead. That shift changes everything. You stop asking, "What if I fail?" and begin asking, "What happens if I never fully try?" You stop worshipping talent and start respecting resilience. You stop viewing struggle as proof of inadequacy and begin seeing it as evidence that you finally entered reality honestly. Because reality contains friction. Always, nobody escapes it. The strongest people are not people without fear. They are people who stopped organizing their entire life around avoiding it. That is the breakthrough, not confidence, not motivation. The willingness to let your current identity crack open under the pressure of genuine effort. Because hidden inside that fracture exists something infinitely more powerful than fragile perfection, a self capable of growth without needing illusion to survive. Rewiring for resilient growth. Awareness changes nothing by itself. That is the uncomfortable truth. You can understand every pattern, every trauma, every defense mechanism, every reason you sabotage yourself, and still remain trapped. Because insight without action becomes another form of avoidance. Another way to feel progress without risking transformation. Real change begins when the nervous system experiences reality differently. Not intellectually, physically, emotionally, biologically, because your brain will not believe your future through words alone. It believes through repetition, through evidence, through lived experience. That means rewiring requires something most people avoid instinctively: micro-risk. Small acts of vulnerable effort repeated consistently. Not dramatic reinventions, not overnight transformations. Those usually collapse quickly because the nervous system perceives them as threats. Real rewiring happens quietly, gradually. You train the brain to survive exposure safely. One small risk at a time. Speak up once. Post the project once. Apply once. Show your work once. Try honestly once. And then survive the discomfort without retreating immediately. That survival matters enormously, because every time you tolerate vulnerability without collapsing psychologically, the nervous system updates itself. The brain learns, we can survive this. That lesson rewires identity slowly. This is why resilient growth begins with tolerating emotional friction instead of escaping it. Most people are not destroyed by failure itself. They are destroyed by their interpretation of failure. They treat failure like identity evidence, proof they are inadequate, unworthy, limited. But failure was never meant to define worth. It was meant to refine execution. That distinction changes everything psychologically. Because if failure reflects identity, every attempt becomes terrifying. But if failure becomes information, now mistakes lose emotional poison. The mind relaxes slightly. Curiosity replaces panic, and curiosity creates growth far more effectively than shame ever could. This is why reframing matters deeply. You are not a failure. You experienced an outcome. You collected data. You discovered friction points. That is all. But fragile egos personalize everything. A rejected application becomes, "I am worthless." A failed project becomes, "I am untalented." A difficult season becomes, "I will never succeed." The mind turns temporary experiences into permanent identities automatically. Rewiring means interrupting this process consciously. You stop building identity from isolated outcomes and start building identity from behavior instead. Not, "Did I win?" but, Did I engage honestly? Did I stay consistent? Did I move despite discomfort? That shift creates emotional durability, because outcomes fluctuate constantly, but character compounds. And resilient people understand something critical: confidence is not built from constant success. It is built from surviving uncertainty repeatedly. The nervous system becomes stronger each time you enter discomfort voluntarily and remain standing afterward. That is why micro-risks matter. Tiny exposures to uncertainty, tiny acts of courage, tiny confrontations with avoidance. Most people wait to feel ready before acting, but readiness rarely arrives first. Action creates readiness. Movement creates clarity. Effort creates adaptation, and adaptation slowly dissolves fear. Not completely, but enough to keep moving. This is where many people fail psychologically. They expect fearlessness before action. But fearless people barely exist. Even highly successful people feel uncertainty constantly. The difference is they stopped interpreting uncertainty as danger. That changes everything, because uncertainty is not a sign to retreat. It is usually a sign that growth is nearby. The old nervous system interprets discomfort as proof you should stop. The rewired nervous system interprets discomfort as proof you are finally leaving stagnation. That reinterpretation transforms your relationship with effort itself. You stop chasing emotional comfort constantly and begin respecting tension as part of development. Like muscles tearing before growth, like fire reshaping metal, like pressure forming structure. The strongest identities are not protected from friction. They are forged through it. This also means abandoning the fantasy of perfect transformation. No final version of yourself is arriving. No magical future where fear disappears permanently. Growth remains uncomfortable at every level. Higher goals create higher uncertainty. Higher visibility creates higher scrutiny. The difference is resilience increases too. You become harder to destabilize emotionally, harder to discourage, harder to paralyze through self-doubt. Not because the doubts vanish, because they stop controlling behavior. That is freedom psychologically, not the absence of fear. The ability to move while fear exists, and eventually something profound happens internally. The pain of staying the same becomes heavier than the pain of trying. That is the turning point. When stagnation hurts more than vulnerability, when regret hurts more than embarrassment, when unrealized potential becomes unbearable to carry. At that moment, the nervous system finally becomes willing to change, not because growth suddenly feels safe, because remaining trapped feels worse. And this is the final rewiring. You stop asking life to guarantee success before effort. You stop demanding certainty before movement. You stop protecting fragile identities through avoidance. Instead, you build a stronger self entirely. A self capable of effort without guarantees. A self capable of failure without collapse. A self capable of growth without requiring perfection. That is resilient growth, not becoming fearless. Becoming too alive to spend another decade hiding from your own potential. If this video unsettled something inside you, good, because comfort has been lying to you for years. Most people spend their lives protecting a fragile version of themselves that never actually gets to live. They stay hidden inside excuses, inside distractions, inside carefully engineered self-sabotage, not because they are weak, but because safety became their religion. But eventually the cost becomes unbearable. You wake up one day realizing your biggest enemy was never failure. It was hesitation, the constant negotiation with fear, the endless postponement of your own life, and the terrifying part: nobody is coming to rescue you from that cycle. No perfect moment, no magical burst of confidence, no external validation finally making you feel ready. At some point you either step forward unfinished or spend your life worshipping the ghost of who you could have become. That choice is happening quietly every single day. In your routines, your habits, your avoidance, your silence, your excuses, and deep down, you already know which direction your life is moving. So if these ideas resonated with you, if some part of you is exhausted from living half alive, then do not let this become another video you consume and forget tomorrow. Use it, let it confront you. Let it expose the patterns you keep protecting, because the people who transform their lives are not always the smartest. They are the ones finally willing to stop hiding from themselves. Subscribe to the channel if you want daily reminders that challenge comfort instead of feeding it. Share this video with someone who secretly knows they are capable of more, but keeps shrinking to survive. Someone stuck between fear and potential. Someone tired of performing safety while their real life waits in silence. And maybe most importantly, start proving to yourself that your future deserves more than your excuses. One honest action at a time.